Here's the 30-second lesson on what legends know. Never practice nunchucks in a crowded room. Never eat chole before a road trip. Always take your shirt off before you iron it. Don't take a call near a swimming pool. And don't forget, saving is not investing. Legends don't just save, they invest in mutual funds. Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
We've been caught up with our politics, also the Olympics. The rest of the world is caught up with much more. America, in particular, is engaged in the presidential election and all that's going on. There was an assassination attempt on Trump, change of candidate by the Democratic Party, then the choice of running mates, etc., etc. So the headlines have all been taken away, not to forget what's been happening between Israel and Iran, and this expectation that any time Iran will now retaliate against Israel, setting off one more cycle of attacks, counterattacks, attacks, revenge, then further counter-revenge, etc., etc. In the middle of all of that, it looks like we've forgotten that there is another war going on now for more than 2 years. That's the war in Ukraine. Now, war in Ukraine sort of looks stalemated. It's been stalemated right along the frontier. Some fighting's been going on for a long time now. This is grinding action. Grinding action where no side is taking anything. Frankly, Ukraine is taking nothing. The Russians might be nibbling at a little bit of territory every night, now and then, although the last village of any size, or maybe it's a small town of any size that they had taken, was Bakhmut, that we spoke about. That was quite some time back, and that is today rated as among the most intense and long infantry battles fought since the Second World War, because that was an area where both sides were fighting for a long time in strength, and both sides were flinging troops into what was called a meat grinder. After that, the Russians have made minor advances here and there and generally kept on pushing at the Ukrainian defenses and also degrading Ukrainian capabilities, because the Russians have a much better supply line of artillery ammunition, particularly 155 mm artillery ammunition. Ukrainians are struggling. Also, Ukrainian allies are struggling because they haven't quite built the industrial base to make ammunition on that scale. That said, in this situation, what does Zelensky do? What does Volodymyr Zelensky do to draw the world's attention back to him and to the fact that there is a war going on in his country in which a lot of the world is involved? The Western world has a stake. For Putin, it's a very severe political challenge because he must not be seen to be not winning the war in Ukraine. There is a large support base that Putin has, say, in what is called as Global South, although I don't like that term, who might, just because of the deep anti-Westernism or deep anti-Americanism, might want to see Putin not losing or ideally winning in Ukraine. In this situation, Zelensky's concern is that everybody started thinking that the bigger security threat to the world, particularly the biggest security threat to Western interests, is the Israel-Iran or the Middle East situation. Now, he wants his country, the war in his country, to be the biggest object of Western interest. So what does he do? He does two things. I will tell you the first one first because that is short and that is simple. That is that he announces that his Air Force has received its first F-16s. These are just about 8 F-16s. We have statements from a Lithuanian leader. We have statements from other Europeans. Looks like these have been transferred from the Netherlands. Some of these NATO countries have offered to transfer their F-16s to Ukraine on the promise that they will then get higher capability aircraft from the Americans, like in the F-22, F-35 range. So they will be replacing their F-16s, which they might consider obsolete now. These F-16s were displayed also in flight, a pair at a time, with AMRAAM, AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles with a long range. Now, 8 aircraft, how much difference will that make? There was also a video of Zelensky giving away colors to his new pilots of these aircraft who've been trained by the NATO air forces. So that was a morale booster. I don't know when we'll see these planes flying, because with 8, will you fling them into a fight? I don't know, but maybe more will come in. That can make some difference to the battlefront. The other thing that's happening is, that's giving him a sense of urgency, is that US elections have to take place. And nobody right now knows who's going to win. And if Trump wins, the picture for Zelensky will change. The picture will change because Trump is on record as having said that he will stop the war on day one, which pretty much means he will ask both sides to stop where they are. Stop where they are, which would also imply that Russians in that case can keep the gains that they have made. It's still about 15% of Ukraine's territory. Quite a bit of it they had earlier as well. It might also mean Russians legitimizing their control over Crimean Peninsula, which they had taken in 2015 and which the rest of the world has not accepted, and which Zelensky wants back. He's not willing to compromise, to accept a compromise that cedes the Crimean Peninsula to the Russians. In that situation, because he wanted to shift the headlines, so the first thing was the display of these F-16s. It's also to shore up morale at home. The second thing that he's done this week, in fact, he's done over the last 3 days, and when we in India were so caught up in the Olympics and the Vinesh Fogart situation, he has actually sent in an invasion task force into a part of Russia. So see the map. Remember the town of Kursk? If you've been reading military history, even if you've been reading books on the Second World War, or any non-fiction on the Second World War, you will remember that this is where Kursk is known. It's famous in history as the place where the largest tank battle of any kind ever was fought. Nearly 3,000 vehicles from the German side, Nazi side, and the Soviet side. This is where the Nazis had come in earlier, then they had been pushed back, then they tried to take it, and then there was this long battle, the greatest armored vehicle battle in the history of humankind. This is where the Russian T-34 tanks, they were used in large numbers, they were destroyed in large numbers, but they won the day, and that's what turned the war, and that's what decisively started the defeat of the great German army. They began to get pushed back. It is that city of Kursk. By Russian standards, it's not a small city. By European standards, it's not a small city, because Russia in any case is a sparsely populated zone. It's about 500,000 people. So what does Zelensky do? He takes a task force, about a brigade. A Ukrainian brigade is usually a bit bigger than, say, the Indian standard brigade, say about 4,000 people. Now, there are people on the military bloggers on the Russian side, military bloggers on the Ukrainian side, open source intelligence people, and a lot of propaganda that spreads on Telegram channels on both sides. So I've seen a lot of that. So the estimates of the task force vary from 1,000 troops, right, 1,500 troops to 4 brigades. I would say that from whatever credible I read, it's possibly about a brigade strength, but a mechanized brigade strength with a bunch of tanks, armored vehicles, striker vehicles. See that's the vehicle also that the Indian Army is evaluating for itself. That's an armored vehicle, but wheeled armored vehicle. But what this can do is, it can get troops to move in very fast. Now, this was actually in an apparently lightly defended area, because what's happened is, because Russians have been attacking Ukraine. So sometimes when you are attacking across the front, you don't cater for the possibility that maybe in some place the other side will come into attack. And that is what Zelensky has done just now. So what he's done is, he's gone east of, sort of northeast of Kharkiv, the big city in Ukraine, which have been under attack from the Russians in the past, and on the borders in whose direction, not that close to Kharkiv, but in east of Kharkiv, Russian forces have been pushing, trying to take small enclaves or small chunks. They succeeded in taking some, they were pushed back from some, and they've suffered heavy casualties. That advance has bogged down. As a result, Russians also have about 50 to 75,000 troops with associated armor, etc., and artillery all bogged down there. Now, further north of that, Zelensky has opened a new front, and this time by going inside Russian territory, and that is in the direction of Kursk. If you see the map, you can understand what's going on. So this is a case of Shikari khud shikar ho gaya. So Russians who've been attacking and invading Ukraine, they've now been invaded in their mainland. This does not mean, please do not think for one moment that this means that Kursk has fallen or that Ukrainian forces are anywhere near Kursk. Yet, Ukrainian forces have at least gone into the Russian territory to about 10 kilometers, if not more, and they are hunkering down after 10 kilometers and fortifying their positions. And looks like they don't have the intention to give it up. Again, if you see the military bloggers from the Russian side in this case, not the Ukrainian side, they say that the bands, the raiding parties of Ukrainians with armored vehicles, because it was lightly defended the area, they've gone deeper. They've gone in some places as deep as 35 kilometers, carried out some raids, but disengaged and come back. So that is to cause harassment, change the headlines. They change the headlines in Ukraine, change the headlines in Russia, but also most importantly, change the headlines internationally. So this is Zelensky saying, listen, there is a war going on here. I am fighting a war and I am in the fight and I am fighting and I have so much strength and so much in my guts that I can even cross international borders and deliver these blows on Putin's army. Now, what will Putin do? The Russian government has declared this to be a federal emergency, so they are not taking it lightly. The Russian Chief of General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, briefed Putin on a video. These are all things given out by the Russians. So this is not being seen as a minor pinprick that they can ignore. Alexei Smirnov, the governor of the region, acting governor, he says this is an emergency and a very difficult situation. The Ukrainians have not formally spoken about it. However, Zelensky at a press meet said that it is Moscow that invaded our country, and now the Russians also must feel the pain. So that's as close as he went to admitting that such a raid has been carried out. I'm not calling it an invasion. An invasion would mean a large number of forces. Ukraine doesn't have that many. This, if anything, is a tactical move. It's a move to distract. The Russians also raise the morale of own troops and draw the attention of the rest of the world. Now, I will discuss in a couple of minutes about the possibilities, the possible motives that Zelensky might have had and the possible gains he might make as a result of this. If you just calculate the territory, however, and this is from all the publications, including mill bloggers on both sides, if you just count the territory, these are very wide open plains. In fact, all the videos that come out of this war tells you that there is no place to hide in these plains. There is no terrain. There is nothing you can get behind, even for a helicopter or maybe an artillery battery. There is no place to hide. There is no camouflage, no place to hide, no forests, no mountains, nothing. You are exposed wherever you are. In that situation, with this raid across not a very wide frontier, because they moved in about 10 kilometers. So if you move in about 10 kilometers across a 15-20 kilometer front, right? These are very long land borders. You take a lot of territory. So the estimates right now are that Ukrainians have taken about 150 square kilometers of territory. In the context of this war, generally it won't matter so much, except that if you see the territory that the Russians have been nibbling at and counting as gains since they took over Bakhmut, which by the way still continues to be contested because Ukrainians keep on flinging in troops there, and that's been criticized by many in Ukraine also, but also internationally, that this is an unnecessary sacrifice of troops in the meat grinder. But still, since the almost taking of Bakhmut, the Russians have not taken about 150 square kilometers of territory. That is how contested these small territorial battles are. And in that situation, Ukrainians have gone into Russian mainland. This is This is north of Belgorod. Belgorod is another border town near Ukraine. That is another one where Ukrainians had carried out a raid earlier, but those raids have either been carried out with artillery or they've been carried out using Russian exiles living in Ukraine. Russian rebel exiles living in Ukraine who've carried out those raids. This is the first time that the Ukrainian armed forces have used their elite troops and elite units to do this. Now, while this is happening, other attacks have also been carried out simultaneously. For example, there are drone raids and missile raids on the airbase in the city called Lipetsk. In Lipetsk, pictures have come out of the ammunition dump at the airbase burning. Similarly, an airbase in Sevastopol in Crimea has been hit. At the same time, say 4 days back, a submarine, a kilo-class submarine, the same type that Indian Navy also has, except that this is a very new kilo-class. I would have thought a kilo-class, maybe the Russians just have it, an old kilo-class, a discard, they had it there as a decoy. No, it's a kilo-class that was commissioned in 2014. It was commissioned in 2014. It was hit by the Ukrainians in a missile strike in 2023, last year as well. That was relatively less damage. That had been repaired and was undergoing trials now in Sevastopol. That's now been hit by a Ukrainian missile and sunk. That makes it the 15th capital asset of Russian Navy to be sunk in Black Sea. Last week, Ukrainians announced, and this is not something that was contested by anybody. In fact, all the international military sources have confirmed it, that the Russians now have withdrawn all their capital assets, all their naval vessels of any size from the Black Sea. So in fact, this is a remarkable story. While there have been many other ups and downs in this two-plus year war, the remarkable story is how Ukraine has been able to defeat the great Russian Navy in Black Sea and force it to empty out of Black Sea, despite the fact that Ukraine had no navy to begin with. That also gives us new lessons in how drones and missiles are changing the nature of the battlefront. And these are drones which are not just aerial drones, they are marine drones also. And those are the ones that Ukraine has used very, very effectively. Now, a submarine gets hit in the same week. 2 air bases are hit. In one of these attacks, on the same day as the submarine was hit, at least one set of S-400 Triumph, that's the same missile that India has been buying, and deliveries are delayed now. One of those batteries got hit. Some accounts say 1 battery, Ukrainians claim 4 batteries. We don't know, but something was hit because there are pictures. Also, the pictures of that air base also tell you that some frontline Russian Air Force aircraft were also hit. Now, you can always say that Russians have this enormous capacity to take damage. So, what is a few more aircraft hit? They will bring in some more. And you could say the same thing about Kursk also, that Russians could move troops from here and there and balance things out and stabilize this front, and maybe at some point then repel the Ukrainians. In fact, some of the Russian bill bloggers are claiming that Ukrainians came in 23 kilometers inside and they were repelled, but all the rest say that these are raids that the Ukrainians are carrying out after forming a firm base about 10 kilometers inside and surrounding the small town or an overgrown village of Sudza. Sudza is where there is also a Russian garrison, and that Russian garrison seems to be surrounded. In fact, you also see videos of bodies of Russian troops surrendering. In one video, about 50 of them. What I read is on military blogging sites is about a company, but in a war like this, 2.5 years, a company surrendering or getting surrounded and surrendering on either side is not such a big headline, but something seems to be happening around this small town of Sudza, about 10 to 15 kilometers inside Russian territory. In fact, from where the Ukrainian troops formations sit now, Kursk is 85 kilometers. So they are not on the outskirts of Kursk. It's about 85 kilometers. Kursk is just a dateline because it is such a prominent place in the same direction. Kursk is about 85 kilometers. Say Moscow would be about 500 kilometers. about as far as Lahore is from Delhi for ease of understanding. Now, what are the things that Russia could do? So I see four scenarios, four courses of action, COAs as they are called, on Institute of the Study of War. And I will share that link with you. You can read the whole article. It says, first of all, what the Russians could do is basically the conscripts, their own FSB troops, their border guards, and also Donbass militias who are in the rear, because Putin had committed that he will not fling his conscripts into the war in Ukraine, but they are available for the defense of the Russian mainland. So he could collect all of them and send them to Kursk region to drive out the Ukrainians, because Ukrainians sitting there having a foothold there is a big embarrassment for him politically as well. Plus, they also threaten his rear because he's got large bodies of troops facing Kharkiv in that area. Second thing he could do is he could deplete his northern grouping. The northern grouping is facing Kharkiv. Now, northern grouping carried out widespread assaults in Kharkiv area, they had limited objectives, not to take Kharkiv, but they nibbled at some territory, but also suffered heavy casualties and damage attrition. So they've now been replenishing themselves and also recouping and getting fresh troops. So Putin could easily shift bodies from there to drive these pesky Ukrainians out. But if that happens, then Zelensky would have achieved a purpose, which is to reduce pressure on his front in areas where he is on the defensive. Remember, in the 1965 war, why did India decide to open the front from Vaga in the Lahore sector? The idea was never to take Lahore. The idea was that because Indian forces were under pressure in Cham Jaurian in the Jammu and Kashmir sector, Cham had fallen, Akhnur had come under threat, and that would have cut off a lot of areas in Kashmir for India. To relieve the pressure, India opened the front in the Lahore sector, so Pakistanis would be forced to pull back their forces to defend their mainland. Something like that on a much smaller scale seems to be playing out here as well. So second course of action, thin out or pull out troops from the northern grouping, is something that can be done, but it will have its price for the Russians. For something to happen, Gerasimov himself will have to take a call and go to Putin, because that will be a big change. Third course of action possibly is that Russians could redeploy the reserves that they had collected for the planned 2024 summer offensive, because they also know that there is a US election coming up. They also know that the West's overall support can go up and down, because all the Western countries are democracies. They are subject to public opinion. Also, the Middle Eastern situation is not getting any better, and if Trump comes, all bets are off, everything will change. So he wants to make whatever gains he can in this summer. So he had collected a large body of reserves. Would he then shift some of those to the Kursk area? If that happens, once again, Zelensky would have achieved not just a tactical objective, but a medium-term strategic objective. Again, something that Putin would prefer not to do. And the fourth COA, course of action, is that Putin just uses his aviation, drones, and strike elements to either expel these people or make it so difficult for them and so expensive for them that they say there is no point staying on in this place. So this is what's going on right now. This is a completely different, unexpected, and dramatic turn in this war. If it's so dramatic and so different and so unexpected for us so far away, you can imagine how unexpected it's been for Putin and his generals. The important thing is, in a wide open front like that, with so many sensors, drones, so much aviation assets, it's nearly impossible to achieve surprise. But in this case, Zelensky and his forces have achieved surprise, and possibly because when you get used to seeing forces piling up here and there or gathering here and there, you don't quite imagine. From the Russian side, you would probably imagine that all this build-up on the Ukrainian side is in defense because they are expecting to be attacked. On the other hand, the Russian side is not expecting to be attacked. So something like that seems to have happened in this case. So we will see over the next 2-3 days what happens. However, since we told you about that submarine strike. However, since we told you about that missile strike on the submarine, other interesting things have happened in this battle zone. For example, we've seen now the rise of FPV drones. Now, anybody uses drones, even teenagers know what is an FPV drone. FPV is first person view, which means the pilot sitting on the ground with the controls can see live what the drone is seeing, right? Ukraine, both sides are using those drones, but Ukraine has now used these drones to shoot down 2 helicopters, and those videos have come out, and these are Russian combat helicopters. So can you imagine a $50 drone shooting down maybe an $18 million, $20 million attack helicopter? These are Mi-28 Havoc helicopters of the Russian armed forces. This tells you how the battlefield is changing. And this is only a small part of the story that we've seen play out in the Black Sea in the war against Russian Navy by a country with no navy. In fact, what's happened in Black Sea in this so-called naval warfare is something that merits a completely different episode of Cut the Clutter. And I shall do that whenever I find a window from other news developments over the next couple of weeks.